Hi YouTubers, a Toll Dragon here to give you a quick tutorial on how to navigate the brush tool settings. So as you notice, you'll need to open up Photoshop and have a new artboard selected or displayed. From there you can notice that I have two brush strokes, one being the original grass dune stroke, which is a preset brush already installed with Photoshop, and another being titled Fur, which I had made out of the dune grass brush stroke. And that's what I'm going to show you how to make today. So, once you have your dune grass stroke ready, open up Window and then go to Brush. You'll notice it'll open over here right next to this Window tab. That is just a generic thing. So going to Brush Tip Shape, you'll notice the setups here. You can select other brushes from this menu selection while transferring the pre-selected setup here and transferring it to that brush value. So you'll notice I have the size up larger than 112. You can flip the X and Y axes here and change the value and which direction the dune grass is going to go. From here you'll notice this circular with these two white dots. This is changing the angle of where you're brushing from, as well as how wide or how tall that stroke is going to be. So in this case you may want to do a quick brush and see how that turns out. Notice that this is more vertical and the dune grass is a whole lot shorter. But for this case, you just want them set to their presets. So you can change angle back to 0 and bring that back up to 100. Or if you want a quick little shortcut, going into this menu selection, then hitting or reselecting your current brush will change it back to its generic. So from here we'll go into shape dynamics. Size jitter. So since we're making fur, that size jitter will make it determine how scruffy that fur is gonna be. So in this case we want scruffy. But if you're working on a smoother animal, you'll want to bring that size jitter down. You don't need to handle any of the controls, since those is if you have a pen tool. The angle jitter will determine how far that jitter of angle that we played around in the brush tip shape, how far that differentiates for each and individual stroke. That roundness jitter will also apply to that same scenario, except the roundness, not the angle. So you can go ahead and pause the video while you play with some of those settings and see what happens with your brush. So continuing our lesson from there, I had set the shape dynamics for this brush tool to the necessary selection that we need for our current grass or animal fur. So if you want to go ahead and pause the video real fast one more time to get these down, we'll head on to scattering. So from scattering, as you can see, we got both axes selected. So that higher that number will be, the more spread out the brush will be. And the closer the brush is in, the more generic it's gonna be. Or more of a single brush stroke. The higher the count, the more of the brush is gonna be there. So if you want to go ahead and play with it a little bit more. But other than that, with the count jitter, the lower that is, the lesser that count in the middle is, or more differentiating. Once again, you don't need to do anything with the control. So you can go ahead and play with those settings, see what's happening. Otherwise, feel free to pause the video. So once again, like before, I had set up some pre-settings into where you'll need to have those settings to make that fur brush. So feel free to pause it once more to get those specific settings. Otherwise, we're heading back to texture. So clicking on texture, you'll notice an immediate difference to the brush stroke here just by selecting it. If not, then you probably have all your items to 0, unlike I. But these are the current pre-settings that you will need for that brush, or the fur brush. Do note that these are all color saturations, or at least the majority of them, as well as items to actually determine an actual texture to that fur. So you can feel free to pause the video and play with those settings. If not, we're heading to color dynamics. So here in color dynamics, it's really actually playing with that color more. So this is what allows that black to blue transition to happen. So let's bring up the hue real fast and do a quick draw. You'll notice that now I have a variety of more color, and it's like a rainbow or some sort of acid trip. So I guess a good reference, the higher that number is, the more of an acid trip you're on. The lower that number is, the less of an acid trip you're on. Saturation jitter. So the higher the saturation, the more depth of color that we're gonna have. So as you can see here, bringing that brightness jitter up will change the value from brighter to darker. Purity. Let's see what purity does. So as you notice, it's much more colder or more icy like in this scenario. If we were to bring it up, definitely a lot more saturated. So feel free to play with these settings a tad bit more if you wish. I'll go ahead and change the settings to their generic for our fur. So I had just set the settings to that generic that I had set up, or that standard. As you notice, doesn't seem to be much of a difference. Depending on what creature you're doing, you may want to go into this one a little bit more and play with it. So now going into transfer, this is something that should already be active. So as you play with this, you should notice a difference in how much there is, or the value between the one before and the one after. So if we zoom up here a little bit more, you'll notice this lining is a little bit more less focused on the darks, but more focused on our blues. But if we bring that opacity jitter back down and do another stroke, that black should be back up. So opacity and the flow jitter, things that you can also control from this panel here. This is just a little bit more onto that. Now to help complete my brush stroke for the fur, I have smooth activated. So pouring that brush stroke. So as you can tell, it's still not quite right. Part of the issue is that opacity jitter. We want that back up to 23. But that's not the only thing we need to fix here. We'll need to go back to texture, change that height to linear burn, and you'll notice with that change, a great difference has been made. So let's perform another stroke, and now you can see it's more like the original strokage in that value. You'll notice, however, that you can still see quite through it pretty well. Well, if we go back into brush tip shape, you want to bring that spacing down to close to about 2. Now making another stroke, well, I'll probably bring that stroke through. You'll notice it's a whole lot more dense. And you can see it's much more furry-like. So, in a little bit more of a scenario of how you would see this, if we bring this across like so, you'll notice that building upon these layers, you'll get that fur texture buildup. So that practically covers the fur brush tool. Now, if you want to see another color though, however, let's change that blue to a red. Now you can really see what I mean by changing the foreground and background colors to change that color value for these strokes. Like I said before, there's only a handful of brushes pre-downloaded into Photoshop that looks at that fore and background colors in differentiality. But if you really want to keep that going, you want that color dynamics active for any others. So this concludes our little tutorial on how to make that furry brush. Now the temptation is there that you want to go into these settings with other brush strokes and see what can happen. I don't blame you. I actually encourage you. So with that, I will have a link down below to download the brush if I'm able to. And if you are interested in this background song, it was made by Archie, or in his album Dessolation of Archie. Enjoy and have a good one. P.S. everybody, I almost forgot to mention how to save your newly made brush tool. So if you navigate your pointer to this location here, you'll notice that this icon is here. And once its name will show up, create new brush. That will save your current brush settings as a new brush. And you will have the option to change its name, whether if you do it immediately or by going into your brushes, right clicking on the brush, and then hit rename brush. And when it does save that new brush, it will be at the very end of the whole listing, and that's where you would find your newly made brush. So, yeah.